This podcast is made possible by the support of our Patreon community. Sign up for a monthly or annual membership at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato and choose from a range of rewards. This week, I want to spotlight our Daily Planet Bullpen tier, available for $1 a month or $10 for the year. Members at this level are the first to know about upcoming coverage and get to submit a comment or question to be read during the episode. Sign up today, and thank you to all patrons. One of the most overlooked entries in the supercanon is the 1988 to 1992 television series Superboy. Across 100 episodes of low-budget syndicated glory, the series transformed in front of and behind the camera. Starring John Hames Newton in Season 1 and Gerard Christopher in Seasons 2 through 4, Superboy followed Clark Kent and Lana Lang from the halls of Schuster University to the desks of the Bureau for Extra-Normal Matters in Capital City, Florida. Now, it's time to examine the series, its evolution, highlights, and standout character adaptations. These are the Superboy TV Mixtapes. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superboy fan journey. Me am host, Desiato Anthony. These am Superboy TV Mixtapes, Bizarro edition. Guest am O'Connor Rob. Goodbye.
Call me Bizarro.
How long do you think people would be patient and enjoy it if we kept that up?
Oh my goodness. I'm recalling the All-Star Superman Bizarro speak where it was like it was this amazing novelty for like the first couple of panels, and you're like, oh, this is gonna last the whole issue.
Let me just say this right at the top here. We're here to talk about the Superboy television series depiction of Bizarro, as well as other villains. But when I say other villains, I don't mean to say that Bizarro is a villain, because it's really not the track that this show takes, and it's a beautiful take on the character. But Bizarro and other comic book villains brought to life on the show. But yeah, let me say at the top that I could not be more grateful that this show did not give us the annoying version of the Bizarro speak, where everything is backwards and you have to try to decipher what's being said. It was the me am, and that was great. And that's all I need. So I was so relieved. It went such a long way towards my enjoyment of these episodes.
That's fair, actually. Yeah, like they really streamline it, and they really just kind of distill it and hone it right down to the core element, which is this, confused creature who wants to do the right thing and just wants to enjoy life and isn't setting out to hurt anyone, but just doesn't understand the world. And and by the way, he happens to have Superman's powers, and they do that really, really well for all the kind of challenges they had as a production, and all the limitations of the technology that they had at the time. I think definitely, I'll say it up top, I think Bizarro is one of the highlights of Superboy, and he's one of the key things I point to where I will point to this and go, no, actually, there's something to this show, and you shouldn't discount it. You should actually kind of give it a shot.
I said to Ed Gross last week in our first mixtape episode that for all of its shortcomings, for all of its limitations, the very best of this television series I would put up against anything else. And when I was saying that, specifically in my mind, I was thinking about these Bizarro episodes, which are so strong. I agree with you. Definitely for me, the highlight of the series. It gave us a take on the character where, yes, he's quote unquote defective and confused and misled, but also loyal and kind and selfless. And you really see that in that final two-parter, To Be Human, with him. So it's an amazing depiction. I'm excited to talk to you about him, as well as characters like Nick Knack and Metallo and Kryptonite Kid and Mr. Mxyzptlk. My mileage on those interpretations varied, which we'll get into. But,
same.
But before all of that, right, we've been doing these episodes now on the Superboy TV series, and you've been one of these guys, I feel, kind of like beating the drum for this show for a while now. So here in the United States, right, it was distributed by Viacom, and it aired in first-run syndication. I'm no expert on all of this, but essentially my understanding is that means you're not going through one of the major broadcast networks, but rather the distributor, Viacom in this case, is selling directly to the local stations, the local affiliates. Growing up in Ireland, as you did, how did you come across the show?
So that's a very, very interesting question. So first of all, I should say I have the vaguest of vague memories of being approximately 6, maybe 7 years old in my cousin's house. Now, it's very important to say my cousin had cable. I did not have cable. So he had access to probably 40 or 50 other additional channels back in the days of analog cable. And I distinctly remember watching a scene of a Superman show where he walks out of a bank holding a bag full of dollar bills, and there's police shooting at him, and I'm going, oh my goodness, what the heck is this? This is not Dean Cain. This is not the show I know. It's not Christopher Reeve. And my mum went, oh, that's Superboy. Your cousins have this channel that this program is on. We don't have that channel. Maybe they'll tape it for you. And they promised they would, and they never did. Skip forward maybe a decade later, I'd forgotten about this completely. I was big into Smallville. I was on my big sort of Superman Renaissance kick. And I remembered reading somewhere that there was talk of a new Superman movie. Long story short, I learned all about the Nicolas Cage of it all. And then somewhere along the line, on one of these Superman fan websites, there was something about something called Superman the New Movie, which was allegedly going to star someone called Gerard Christopher. I said, who's Gerard Christopher? The star of a show called Superboy. I said, what the heck is Superboy? Looked it up, and there was, at that stage in time, this is, we're talking kind of 2002, 2003, there was a bunch of really dedicated Superboy fan websites with episode guides and, pictures of the show and like little, primitive MP or .mov kind of files of, the opening credits and all this stuff. And they spoke about the show with such reverence. I want to actually name some of the people. So the main website I looked at was by a guy named Doug Chambers. I think he went by DMWC at the time. And it was just this amazing site with these beautiful illustrations by a guy named Adam DeChannel, who's kind of still knocking around the Superman fandom side of things. And there was another woman named Rennie Cowan who was very involved. And there was another guy, Sam Rizzo. And they had all these websites, and they were so into the show, and they just thought it was this incredible thing. And, admittedly, in hindsight, I think maybe they spoke maybe a little bit too highly of it. Like they kind of sold it as like the best Superman show ever, and there'd never been anything else like this and all this kind of stuff. But, having never really properly seen it, they really, really sold me on the show. And I was fascinated by this. And eventually, I did a bit more research. I learned that Gerard Christopher was selling VHS tapes of the show. I bought one of his tapes. It had Roads Not Taken 1 and 2, Superboy Lost, and Wish for Armageddon on it. Some of the best episodes. And I watched that over and over again. Loved it. Found another guy who sold kind of bootleg tapes of it. Loved those too. Subsequent to all of that, right? So to answer your initial question, did it air in Ireland? My understanding is it aired on Sky 1 initially, which is, again, it's kind of a basic cable channel, which we did have, but I would have been too young to have seen it when it initially aired. And then when it finished, it aired on Sky 2 throughout the 90s. And a lot of the bootleg tapes that were floating around in the mid-2000s were actually taped off Sky 2. And you can see the little Sky 2 bug at the top of them. So they were actually taped off UK broadcasts of the show, which I could have seen had I had cable in those years. But unfortunately, I didn't. So that's my kind of roundabout understanding of how it aired on this part of the planet. I know there's this sort of long-standing kind of myth around Superboy that Warner Brothers created this legal situation whereby it couldn't be aired ever again because they were trying to push Lois and Clark and they didn't want this lower budget show on the air at the same time. Now, my understanding is that was only really the case in North America, and that actually in the rest of the world, Superboy did air kind of on random kind of cable channels and stuff. And that's why obviously it was airing in the UK on Sky 2. So there you go. So I never actually did see it broadcast at all, other than that one time when I was like maybe 6. But my journey with this show really happened online, and I'm so grateful to all those websites. And it's such a wonderful, every time I watch the show, I have a fond memory of what the internet used to be. And I think it's such an important part of my journey with the show, and it's a big part of why I love it so much.
That's awesome. Well, I guess kind of along those lines, at this point in time, I know you've gone much further down the road with your Superman fan journey, and you and your co-host Alan on your podcast, All-Star Superfan podcast. I'm curious now, especially when we look at the Superboy TV show in relation to the live action television series that would follow Lois and Clark, Smallville, now Superman and Lois. You don't have to rank them per se, but I guess I'm just curious what place the Superboy show kind of occupies in your Superman fandom, and especially within the context of those other live action series. Because it's funny, when you were talking about your experience with it and reading about it online and wondering if people maybe made it out to be a little bit more than it was, that's kind of a line that I'm trying to strike in these episodes that I'm doing as well, because ultimately I really, as I keep saying, and it is true, I really did have a good time with my 100 episode binge, but there was a lot that I had to wade through to get to the really good stuff. And so I always want to be respectful of the folks who made the show and the folks who really have such deep affection for it, while also being mindful of not overselling it such that if any of our audience members who don't know the show go to watch it, like, what the hell is Anthony talking about? So it's a line to strike. But anyway, the question, just as far as, what kind of space it occupies now in your fandom?
So apologies in advance. This may be another long answer. So first of all, I'll preface this by saying I do love B movies, and I love bad movies, and I love kind of things that maybe didn't quite reach their potential. And part of why I love them, and I genuinely mean this, is because when something isn't quite right, especially in the era pre-CGI, it kind of takes you on a journey of, well, I wonder how they made that, and I wonder how they went about the production of this. And I definitely feel like that's the case with Superboy. And I, by the way, I absolutely love this show. And I always feel, like you just said, I always feel like I have to qualify that by acknowledging that, from a production standpoint, it's not, it doesn't stand up against other Superman shows. And not even Lois and Clark, which came a couple of years later. Even when you take into account when it was made, it probably, as my co-host Alan pointed out, it probably even felt low budget when it was released. But I think the scale of the ambition of Superboy is unmatched by any Superman show. Like, it remains the only Superman show to me ever made that never had any doubt whatsoever in the value of the source material, for better and for worse. It was made in an era when CGI was mostly a speculative concept. And so much of what makes it great is all the painstaking, low budget, practical work and heartfelt elbow grease that went into it. And, I get, like, as you say, what the hell are you talking about? I get why some people can't gel with it, but I also have a deep respect for people who love it dearly. And the more I watch it, the more I count myself among them. And, for me, to answer your question, where does it rank and all that kind of stuff? Look, I know George Reeves holds a more important part in history, and I know that Smallville is objectively better. Lois and Clark is always going to be cemented number one with a bullet for me. It's never going to change. That's my favorite version of Superman. But honestly, if I had to answer honestly, like, what do I watch? But, like, second to that, it's probably going to be Superboy. I watch this show a lot. And I think as well, another big reason that I watch it so often is the episodes are like 22, 23 minutes long. You can just watch them so quickly. I'm pretty sure George Reeves are they're closer to kind of 28, 29 minutes, a lot of those episodes. Am I wrong?
I don't know if they're quite that long, but they are longer. I'm almost certain, because I think commercial breaks generally have gotten longer over the years. So yeah.
So George Reeves is definitely a touch longer. Superboy is you're in, you're out. And yeah, I know the animated shows are around that length as well, but I think there's just something about, the animated shows are obviously Superman, the animated series, which, by the way, had a bunch of writers who wrote episodes of Superboy. By the way, we'll talk about that. Superman, the animated series is obviously far better, but they had just limitless resources. It was literally Warner Brothers themselves were making it. Like, Marv Wolfman told us that when he was making Ruby Spears Superman, he was he would have given anything to have the resources that show had, the animated series. Whereas Superboy, when you're in the room with these actors and they have to bring life to this thing and they only have limited, I just find it so fascinating to watch. I just, there is a litany of reasons why I love this show. I can absolutely acknowledge that it is not this high quality product, but I think it's so endlessly fascinating and I love talking about it.
Listen, man, this is a safe space here. It's quite all right. If Lois and Clark is number one in your heart and this is number two, your points are well taken, but also and even anyone who might be listening to this who really can't fathom spending the amount of time with the Superboy show that you have, or even I have, I think anyone listening can appreciate when you have that connection with something, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. So that's great. And I love that you have that level of fandom of this show. Now,
by the way, like I should be more nostalgic for Superman the Animated Series and Smallville. Like I was the target audience for Superman the Animated Series, and I was pretty much maybe a year or so younger than the target audience for Smallville. I absolutely grew up with those two things. I love those things a lot. But there's just something about Superboy that's just endlessly fascinating to me that I keep coming back to, you know?
There's definitely a charm to it. And like we talked about last week, and I think will be a running theme here, the show really does improve. And you were hitting on this, and Ed brought this up last week, the ambition of the people making the show. I think everyone recognized after that first season, something needs to change, but they probably, by the time they got into season 2 territory, probably could have coasted, but they continued to try to improve the show. What?
No. The only thing I'm going to stop you there. I love the first season. I really do. I think the first season is just so, you know, the second season and the third season, fourth season, they really, really push the comic book aesthetic. The first season is basically like, what if we did the George Reeves show, but he's this cool John Hughes kid in college. And, you know, it was made by the seat of their pants. Like John Haynes Newton did this wonderful interview with comicbookcentral.com where he admitted that, you know, there was episodes of that first season where, you know, they were basically learning how to make a TV show, and they genuinely didn't know how. And there's shots in it where the camera is wobbling a little bit. And like there was episodes where when they finished in the edit, they were so worried that they weren't good enough that they were afraid to air them at all. But I just find it again, it's such a different speed to the rest of the show. And I think a big part of it is John Haynes Newton himself is such a different kind of style of performance. And yeah, people call him wooden, whatever, man. I don't care. Like he definitely grows into the role over the course of those 22 episodes. And he really kind of lays the groundwork for that sort of more human, vulnerable Clark Kent that we'd see from Dean Cain and Tom Welling and, you know, Tyler Hoechlin, Brandon Routh, whoever else. I just love the kind of lower scale, down to earth, journalism heavy stories in that first season where it's like, oh, well, you know, there's a crooked oil owner and he's buying up all the farmland in Smallville and Clark Kent's got to write a story about it. Or there's a problem. There's homeless people living on the beach because this wealthy land developer guy is doing some crooked dealings with this hotel, or, well, you know, just these really small stories that Superman has to deal with. And by the way, and I never hear Superboy fans talk about this, the music in that first season by Kevin Kiner, who is this incredible composer now. He's composed for Star Wars and, you know, all these different things, and DC Titans. He was the composer on that. The music in that first season, man, is so cool. It's just maximum 80s kind of Miami Vice meets Knight Rider, whatever. Oh my God. If nothing else, watch the first season just for Kevin Kiner's music. And that opening sequence in season 1 of Superboy, incredible. Sorry. People always say, oh, the first season was bad and then it got good. I love the first season of Superboy too. And I'll hear nothing bad said about it.
Fair enough. And you haven't heard it yet based on when we're recording, but people will have heard by now the first mixtape that I've been referring to here. And I did say in that what resonated with me about the first season was, to your point, the performance by John Haynes Newton. So much so that a real big struggle I had in season 2 was Gerard Christopher's initial bumbling take on Clark, where he got to
100%.
in seasons 3 and 4, I felt was perfectly calibrated and I enjoyed it a lot. But that season 2 iteration was really tough because it just felt like Clark had this personality transplant and regressed, and it was really tough to kind of settle into that. So I love Newton's performance in the first season. You're right, the music in that first season and throughout is amazing, and that theme is fantastic. And it's one of those things where even in the weakest episode in any season, the music still drives you and keeps you in it, and it goes such a long way. And the other big thing that I pointed out, and I will always stand by this, in that first season, the camaraderie among Clark, Lana, and TJ. Like, they felt like friends. Like you said, I loved that the Schuster Herald was as much of a story engine as it was, and that put them in places where they're reporting on stories, and then we need to bring in Superboy, and journalism felt like it was a far bigger part of the character than it would be even in season 2, even though he's ostensibly still working for the paper. And then you get to the Bureau seasons where the Bureau is so much like the planet, but we're no longer in the journalism realm. It takes some interesting, unexpected turns.
that will always be my biggest question with those later seasons is what made them decide to make it a government agency and not a newspaper? It's like when all the did they have to, was there some weird DC Comics rule that they couldn't make it too much like the Daily Planet or whatever? Because ostensibly Dennis Jackson is Perry White.
Yep.
And Matt Ritter is basically an age displaced version of Jimmy Olsen. And the even the set of the bureau, which is this beautiful set, like it's incredible. It looks like a newsroom. It looks like a bullpen. So that's always the thing I keep coming up against is like, what exactly are Lana and Clark's jobs here? Like they talk sometimes about having to write reports or something like that. And you're like, couldn't they be writing stories?
That's the thing. They went with a very bureaucratic route for this, where it's so much about the paperwork and the filing of the reports. And I think it's probably true to life. Maybe they could have found a more exciting angle for television. But no, I had the same thought. It's the sort of thing, if you changed the Bureau to the Planet and you told me that Lois had red hair and that I was watching an episode of Lois and Clark, I'd be like, oh, okay. Yeah. Like you watch those third and fourth seasons and they feel very much like a young Superman show, far more than a Superboy.
100%. And I think we mentioned this, I don't know, was it in the last episode? It may have even been off mic that, this is really a Superman show. Like Elias Alkind, basically, for anyone who doesn't know, that they had the rights to Superman, Superboy, Supergirl, and Super Pup. And then they sold they licensed Superman out to Canon, and the remaining rights they had were Supergirl, Superboy, and Super Pup. They'd already made a Supergirl movie. They said, well, that didn't really make a lot of money. So they went, right, well, what else can we do? Superboy TV show. So they basically used their leftover rights to make this TV show, and they basically just made a Superman show, and they kind of pushed it as far as they did initially. Obviously, they did the college setting and all that kind of stuff, but like in every other respect, it's basically Superman. Especially when you get to season 3, everyone's still calling him Superboy, but they refer to him as being a man, like on a couple of occasions, and so I think they were kind of just treading the line with the rights they had available to them. But yeah, like he very much is. I don't view this as like, Smallville is, well, for parts of Smallville, it's very much a story about how Clark Kent became Superman. This is basically just Clark Kent as Superman, but they call him something else,
And are you cool with that? Because that was one of the things that Ed and I talked about. And Ed was very much on the wavelength of, hey, like, whether you call him Superman or Superboy, these are just the adventures. And he was totally cool with it. Whereas for me, especially in the context of this larger Superboy dive that we're doing, as much as I really enjoyed the show, but especially those last 2 seasons where it's essentially young Superman, there is this part of me that's like, if we're going to do Superboy, I want to see more of a journey, more of an arc for Clark. I want to see more of the trappings of the Superboy lore. So I do bump up against that a little bit. Do you at all? Or are you just cool with it as it is?
I would say, yeah, if I was coming to this as a fan of, the Superboy comic concept, I probably would bump up again. There kind of is a Legion of Superheroes episode in season 2, but they can't, either they couldn't or they didn't call it that. And that there's no Crypto, there's no Chief. Well, there's Lieutenant Harris in season 1. He's kind of Chief Parker. Yeah. Like, in a lot of respects, it's kind of a proto Lois and Clark. Like we have he doesn't live in Smallville, but he goes home to Smallville a lot like Superman or Clark would do in Lois and Clark. And, he's very, it does really follow the formula of Superman rather than Superboy. He's already left Smallville. He's gone into the world and he has taken on this mantle. Whereas in the Superboy stories, it's very much like he's a child and he does this at home with his parents while he's going to high school. So they feel like different things to me. And I think I heard you talk about it in your last episode with Gerard Christopher. Does he think that Lana would be the end game romance for Clark in this world? And for me, that's definitely the case. Like I don't think this guy goes on to meet Lois Lane or any of that sort of stuff. I think in this particular world, Lana Lang is his ultimate endgame love interest, So it's just a very, very alternate take on the whole thing.
I mean, maybe the way to look at this is it kind of walks that line and maybe bridges a bit of a gap where if you are coming at this as a Superboy fan, I do think there's enough there for you to grab onto. But if you're not as keen on the Superboy concept, this really plays very much so, especially in the later seasons, as far more of a young Superman show. So maybe this does actually walk a pretty fine line. I can go with that. Now, we'll get into the Bizarro of it all, but one other big picture question, just kind of piggybacking off of the conversation I had with Ed last week. We talked about the conception and production and evolution of the show and those changes that you see in front of and behind the camera across the 4 seasons. But in terms of the narrative of the show, the kind of the big picture question that we were tackling was Clark Kent's arc, if he has one, over the course of the series. And ultimately where we landed is he doesn't really. Trying to figure out where he comes from is probably the closest that we get, but it's not something that's a huge driver for the character when you look at the totality of the series. And it also doesn't ultimately have a payoff because we end the series and he still doesn't actually know where he's from. So I guess the question I have for you is, do you see any series-long arc for the character? And if not, is that okay? Is it a failing of the show, or is it just not what the show was intended for and we don't need to look for one?
Not really, to be honest. And to answer your other question, no, I don't think it's a failing of the show. I think it's what the majority of TV shows were designed to be at the time, where, every episode has to accommodate for the fact that this may be the first episode a viewer ever sees, and they need to just have the broad strokes available to them. And if there's any arc that happens, it needs to happen in the space of that 20 minutes. And then, the next episode needs to act like you've never seen it. Not really. No, I don't think so. I think there are obviously exceptions to the rule where he learns things that are then unlearned at the end of episodes, like that absolutely incredible episode with George Lazenby, where he kind of technically meets Jor-El and Lara, but then forgets about it at the end of the episode. I would say maybe Lana has a bit of an arc over the course of the series, but I don't know if that's by coincidence or design, really, because she starts off very kind of just ditzy, very party animal, very just sort of social butterfly type stuff. And then over the course of the series, she develops very real feelings for Superboy that conflict with her feelings for Clark. And then by the time we get to the Bureau and all that kind of stuff, you can really see her gravitating not more, but definitely as much towards Clark as she is towards Superboy, to the point where in season 4, she's kind of properly conflicted between the two. And she begins to realize that maybe there's a connection between the two in the very final episodes. Again, I don't know if that was something they actually planned or if it was just something that sort of naturally happened. And then I think obviously Lex Luthor has something of an arc as well. Now it kind of trails off in season 4, but we definitely see him going from kind of a more Gene Hackman kind of mad capitalist who just wants to make a bunch of money into this guy who's just driven by vengeance and revenge, and he just becomes this insane, almost Joker-like mass murderer type guy over the course of the rest of the series. And then in season 4, obviously everything happens with his sister and all that kind of stuff. I still think Know That an Enemy is one of the best Lex Luthor stories ever. And Bizarro, we'll talk about Bizarro shortly. I think he has a very substantial arc, but Clark, I don't know. I don't think it was really designed for that. I think they kind of tease. Literally 2 times they tease that, something greater is in store for this guy. The Road to Hell episode with Ron Eli playing the older Superboy because they couldn't use the other word. He mentions that there will come a time where he is not called Superboy anymore, and then rites of passage. The final episode kind of hints that there's something greater coming, but I don't think there's any really substantial arc for Clark. No.
That's fair.
But I don't think that's a failing of the show. I think it's just the way the show was designed.
No, I hear you. I mean, look, 10 seasons of Smallville, all about that journey. I can't help but have that in my head and try to look for that elsewhere. But even looking at something like Lois and Clark, at least you have that relationship between them that progresses and evolves over the course of the show. But I do agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily a failing here.
I think Lois and Clark had the most substantial character arc for Clark Kent in any TV show. I mean, Smallville's great, but I think the actual trajectory of his journey could have happened over 4 seasons, whereas it happened over 10. Whereas Lois and Clark, you can actually point to every single season and say, this is how he progressed in this season. And for me, it culminates in that episode where he meets Lord Nor / General Zod. And Lord Nor says, well, who are you fighting for? And he says, I am fighting for my people. For me, that's the moment where Clark Kent really becomes Superman as we know him in the comics in that series. But anyway, sorry, we're not here to talk about Lois and Clark.
Listen, I love that. I love that new Krypton arc. We did a whole episode on it, and it was so much fun to revisit. The last thing I'll say kind of about this arc question, because I was thinking about this after I talked to Ed, is specifically this notion of Clark learning where he's from. And it's interesting. Like I keep coming back to, this show comes at such a weird place in Superman history because Superboy's gone from the comics, and you have people who are working on the post-crisis comics like Mike Carlin writing episodes of the show, yet it's produced by the Salkinds who did the movie. So I feel like it draws from and touches on a few different aspects, and it is an interesting blend in certain respects. And what I came to is I wonder if maybe the lack of an answer for Clark about Krypton maybe stems at least in part from where we were in the post-crisis comics, right? Like I know you guys just covered John Byrne's Man of Steel reboot, and how at that point in time, it was really this emphasis on Clark's human side, his humanity. And for me, that was, even though that formed the basis of the character that I grew up reading and loving, looking at it now, I feel like, well, I think there needs to be a little bit more of a balance, right, between the Earth side and the Kryptonian side. But anyway, I just wonder if maybe that influence of the comics is bleeding in a little bit, and that's why maybe we only go so far with Krypton.
Absolutely. Like I think you can see the kind of fingerprints of post-crisis Superman all over the show. And I mean, Gerard Christopher said it in your interview with him that, especially the scenes in Smallville, the Kents are why he is the way he is. That there is no influence at all from the Jor-El or the Lara of it all. And, unless I'm mistaken, you would know better than I do now at this stage. But in Superboy comics, he does know that he is from Krypton throughout his teenage years. Whereas in this show, he doesn't at all. Like that's way more post-crisis, So and there is no mention of any Krypton at all. Like the entire idea of becoming Superboy and all that sort of stuff, it comes from him, which is like and I know it's your preferred way of doing things as well. Like he actually comes up with this idea himself. Now they don't really illustrate that as well as they do on Lois and Clark, where he really sits down and thinks about it and talks it out with the Kents. In Superboy, it's very much he gets a phone call from his mum and she's like, are you thinking of becoming Superboy, Clark? And he goes, I don't know, Mum. And then a scene later he does, But no, to answer your question, I think post-crisis is all over this. And I think, when we look at other characters, Lex Luthor, literally, I've said this before on our show, literally the only time we've ever seen Lex Luthor's post-crisis origin story is in Superboy, the TV show, which seems like such a, strange paradox, but it is the case.
Yeah, that is kind of crazy. And we'll be covering Lex next week with Michael Bailey, and it should be really interesting to take another look at those Lex-centric episodes. But here we are now talking about Bizarro, primarily, introduced in 2 episodes early on in season 2. So now, of course, we're in the Gerard Christopher era of the series. The episodes are Bizarro, The Thing of Steel, and The Battle with Bizarro, both written by Mark Jones. The origin of Bizarro here on the show, right out of the comics with the duplicator ray.
Yeah, 100%. Like, was it Professor Dalton in the comics, but it's Professor Peterson here. Like, that's the only real substantial difference. You have the duplicator ray, you have Superboy coming to help out. And wasn't the lightning strike even in the comics?
I think it was. It hasn't been that long since I read it, but I'll be honest, all the Superboy stuff is really blurring together now. but yeah, that same essential setup where you have Superboy and a scientist and this duplicator ray and an experiment that goes awry. But yeah, here on the Superboy television show is Professor Peterson, and he uses the duplicator ray on a rose, right? But the flower that results from it is square and white and doesn't resemble an actual rose. And then you have this lightning strike, and Superboy gets blasted with the ray. And when he steps aside, he sees that this Bizarro has been created, and even says he looks so bizarre. And of course, Bizarro takes that to mean I'm Bizarro. My name is Bizarro.
Army Bizarro.
Yeah. Just in terms of look, I mean, there's so much to talk about with this presentation of the character, but the look, and kind of going back to what you were saying before about not shying away from its comic book inspiration. Yeah, what stands out to you about the visual presentation of this?
I would say, I was thinking about this today, like the way they design, and I'm trying not to be pretentious and oversell what is a low budget, essentially B movie production. But like, if you look at the way the mask is structured, it almost has like an Art Deco kind of statuesque look to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I would say is I always wish they had kind of accentuated the jagged edges of it a bit more with, maybe a bit of like an eyeshadow or just some contouring. I sound like an Instagram kind of makeup influencer now, but just paint it gently with a little bit of black in some bits, just to highlight the edges of it. Because I think the way it was filmed at the time, sometimes in these wide shots, you can't really make out the detail of it. And even close up, it just sort of looks like a big glob of white. Whereas in certain shots, you can really see how impressive it is. And I just wish maybe that they'd accentuated that a little bit. But like, by and large, it's a really impressive look. And it's a really kind of like a haunting look. If that, it really stays with you when you see him. For a kid's show, it's really impressive. Really, hats off to them.
To do Bizarro practically and as accurately as they did, I think is no small feat, and they really pulled it off. And I do think haunting is the perfect word. There is something hypnotic or captivating. You really can't look away. And yes, that's the mask and the makeup, and it's Douglas Myers, the performer, and what he was able to do, the voice, but even more so the movements, the body language, what he's able to convey with just the tilt of his head and a look while you can't even see his face. It's really, truly remarkable. We've seen Bizarro, specifically in live action now, brought to life a few times. Is there anything that even holds a candle to this? I mean, something like Superman and Lois, for example. How do you feel that compares?
I thought that was a fun subversion of expectations, and I really liked seeing Tyler Hoechlin kind of like turn the coin on his performance. And yeah, it was enough Bizarro that I appreciated. It was good, it was strong, and it was solid, and I liked how they developed it into becoming Doomsday eventually. I've no ill will towards that version. I shout out to the Lois and Clark version as well. They did a semi-decent job of the sort of John Byrne reboot version of Bizarro, and they involved Lex Luthor in it, which I like. We covered that on our show as well. I think they missed a step by not acknowledging the kind of iconic comic book look at all. It was literally just Dean Cain the entire time. Like, maybe even in the final, Alan made this point, not me, that in the final moments of the episode, maybe he could have degraded a little bit and kind of they could have introduced the white makeup then. They didn't. The Smallville version, I think it's a fine episode. It's kind of just another evil, sexy Tom Welling version of Superman. It's not really Bizarro,
Yeah, with the white flickering on his face. I mean, the best thing I would argue that Smallville did with Bizarro was, and I don't even want to spoil this for people who are maybe still making their way through this series, but there's a great twist with Bizarro in season 7, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. But that moment that they get to with that was genuinely surprising. It's one of my favorite moments. But no, overall, I mean, I take this far and away over anything else. The Lois and Clark version, I agree with you guys. I think that I loved having the Lex connection there and straight out of the comics of the time. The thing about not having any sort of physical deformity, yes, you lose that accuracy to the source material, but I can put that aside. But I do think there is something intrinsic in the character of Bizarro where he might have the powers and the memories, but it's jumbled. And there's also this physical line between the characters. And Superboy, the TV series, makes great use of that, where he is regarded as this monster, as this freak, as he's making his way through that strip mall there. And you see the effect that it has on him to be regarded that way. But so it is a key part of the character. So I agree with you. I do like that Batman episode of Lois and Clark a lot, but I do think that's a key ingredient that was just missing there. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page.
I want to go back to Douglas Meyer as well, by the way, because you mentioned the movements and the kind of the body language he has, and that really stuck out to me watching the initial two-parter again today. Was just how well he carries himself. And shout out to the Superboy Beyond podcast. Those guys really fly the flag for Superboy, and I know you've had Chris on your show, and he was great. And they actually interviewed Douglas Meyer. And he's a fascinating career. Like he apparently was a mime for years in LA. And I don't want to say that he was sought out for the role or that's why he got the role or something like that. But he was very much in tune with kind of the world of like miming and, carrying yourself in these strange ways and stuff like that. And I think that definitely helped his performance.
Interesting. Well, it's funny too, as we're mentioning these other instances, Dean Cain, Tom Welling, Tyler Hoechlin, in all three of those cases, those guys also played Bizarro or the Bizarro-esque character, whereas here you have a different performer. And I think this worked so well for everything that Douglas Meyer's brought to it. Also the fact that, especially considering we're talking about a show that was more limited in its budget and technology, I think trying to have Gerard play both roles and interact with himself, I don't know how far we would have gotten, whereas having a different performer doing it, you get the two of these guys together and there's a very, physical, visceral connection between the two of them. And I know I'm really skipping ahead, but when we get to Bizarro's final two-parter in season 4, To Be Human, where he becomes human, I know in Ed's book, they talk about how there was a discussion about, well, should it be Douglas playing the human version of Bizarro or should it be Gerard? And I'm so glad they went with Douglas because just as a fan, you have this curiosity of like, what does this guy actually, what does this guy look like? But also just, not to say as a reward, but just to give him the opportunity to play this other side of the character that he'd been playing for so long. It's really, I'm very glad, I'm so glad they went the way they did with this.
I agree. And if you are Dean Cain bouncing off, a stand-in and then, cheating the shots, then it's basically interchangeable with how they do the animated series where it's Tim Daly voicing both characters. It's cheating, Whereas in Superboy, it's Gerard Christopher and Douglas Barry Myers bouncing off each other, and they're developing a chemistry, and they develop a chemistry over these episodes. And no, neither of them are Shakespearean actors, but you can feel the energy between them. And by the time you get to Be Human, they really do feel like brothers, and it definitely doesn't hurt that they kind of don't look that different. Like they look like they could be brothers, But yeah, like that scene where he runs into the bureau and he sort of tells Superboy that he knows who he is or whatever, and Superboy grabs him by the shoulders and like rushes him outside, and you think it's mainly because he's afraid of his secret identity, but then you slowly realize no, he's just so delighted to have someone on the same level as him that he can share this with, that he finally is able to open up to, and you're like, wow, and it would not have been the same had it just been Gerard Christopher acting against the stand-in,
Absolutely. And the other thing too is essentially it's 3 two-parters where we see Bizarro, and then of course he pops up briefly in Obituary for a Superhero, but
Yes.
In his trio of two-parters, there's one in season 2, one in season 3, that's The Bride of Bizarro, and then the To Be Human two-parter in season 4. The show, to its credit, and going back to the ambition behind a lot of this, they get at some big ideas about what it means to be alive and to ultimately, borrowing from the title here, to be human. Like, what does it mean to be human? Is it how you look, how intelligent you are, how you speak, or is it this more intrinsic, innate quality that transcends everything else? I mean, not to not to oversell this, but again, I really do think they get at some genuinely compelling ideas here, and they do it in a way where you really do feel for this tragic figure.
Absolutely. And again, not only will I highlight the original appearance of Bizarro in the comics, they repeatedly mention in that comic, well, he's not really human. It's okay if he dies or something like that. And they say this so callously. And it's almost like they were trying to get past the comics code or something like that. It's like, oh, it's okay if Superman just punches this guy to death because he's not real. He's not alive anyway. It's fine. And like Jimmy Olsen reminds Lois, like, oh, don't worry, Lois. He's not really alive anyway. It's absolutely fine. But then in the John Byrne reboot, they say the exact same thing. 1986, years and years later. And again, credit to my co-host Alan who pointed this out. It's like, it's ridiculous that they still, that they still had this belief that this creature, however simple he may be, that they still just dismiss his intelligence as being less than and, not worthy of life and all this kind of stuff. But lo and behold, Superboy is the one that finally kind of stands up and goes, well, actually, hold on a second. No, I can't turn my back on this guy. He's a part of me. And there's literally a scene in, I think it's Battle for Bizarro, the part 2 of the initial two-parter. He turns to Professor Peterson, who goes, Professor Peterson says, well, don't worry, Superboy, he's not really alive. And Superboy says, well, no, he's a part of me. He's from me. I can't turn my back on him. And they continue that thread throughout all the two-parters. I think that's great, and it's, again, it sets the stage for future versions of Bizarro that we'd see in the comics and definitely in the animated series and stuff like that. But for me, like, I struggle to think of versions of Bizarro outside of the comics that are better than some of these two-parters, honestly.
No, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up about this point of him being alive or not, because when we looked at Bizarro Superboy's debut in the comics, that was something Rich and I were really zeroing in on, because it was surprising how many times in that issue they make the point of him not being alive. And to your point, I'm sure it was because you don't want the kids reading it to be too upset or traumatized or what over
murder,
him exploding at the end. But the fact that in that comic you don't have Superboy articulating anything to the contrary, even for no other reason than to convey the lesson that, alive or not, right, the way that the town was regarding this poor soul, it was not correct, and that we have to look for the humanity where we can and treat others with kindness, even especially when they're different from us. And so I loved in the TV show now where you got Superboy articulating just that. He gets there pretty quickly, this whole idea of he's a part of me, he's like my brother, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe I would feel similarly if I had this being split off from me. There probably would be that kind of innate connection that's already there. So the fact that he pushes back, now that only goes so far, because he does get to the point after Bizarro has impersonated Kent Clark and gone to the college and then to this Halloween party, and he's taken Lana, where Superboy does resign himself to using the green kryptonite against him, and then obviously finds out it doesn't work. But it's not an easy step for him to take, and I like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and he articulates that I'm about to do something that I hoped I wouldn't have to do, which is produce kryptonite. Just on a quick side note, I have to mention this. Did you notice anything interesting about the kryptonite that he uses? Any kind of specific kind of?
Oh no, not specifically. Why?
So the kryptonite that he uses is in the same canister that it was in from the Metallo episode. So it's like a nice follow on from that. So it's like a neat little continuity link there.
That's right. No,
which is rare in this show.
No, that is a really good point. I know I mentioned it in passing, but I do want to circle back to after Bizarro's created and he and Superboy tussle. And of course, Superboy is clocking the fact that, oh, he's as strong as I am. So that throws him for a loop. And then Bizarro has that outing in the strip mall where he's trying to make friends, but everyone's running away from him in horror, and he sees himself in the reflection in the window, and he thinks it's a problem with the glass, and so he kicks the police car through the storefront, which was, there's that. And then the next episode, they blow up a car. I mean, they really did some cool stuff. But then he sees a mannequin with glasses and a dress shirt, and again, he has at least some of Superboy's memories, jumbled though they are, but so now he makes the connection, and he dresses like Kent Clark and goes to the college where conveniently the gang was heading off to this costume party that Clark excused himself from because he had to go work with Professor Peterson and all of that. This whole sequence here, though, where Andy and Lana see Bizarro dressed as Clark and think it's Clark in a costume. Here's the thing. Well, you might expect me to say, this is so ridiculous, I can't believe it, but I don't know, man. I don't know what it was about it, why this worked for me. Maybe it was the actor's performance, but all of them, they just so committed to it of like, Clark, why are you talking like this? Why are you acting this way? And I don't know, it didn't rub me the wrong way, the way I kind of expected it to. I just kind of went along with it. They were all so committed to this bit. What kind of mileage did you get out of that?
Okay, sorry. I thought you were going somewhere else with this, but watching it today, I was kind of thinking to myself, do you know what? I was friends with a lot of, surprise, surprise. I was friends with a lot of the kind of the drama society kids in college, and there was people who took bits a little bit too far. I could buy that this would happen at a college party, that there would be a guy dressed up in such a way and he just, commit to the bit all night. I definitely remember, surprise, surprise, I dressed up as Batman at a college party one night and I did the Christian Bale voice all night and everybody just kind of got used to it and that was fine. So, I could buy being at a college party where there's a guy in a weird sort of Frankenstein makeup and he's doing a weird voice all night and everybody just kind of settles into it, Now,
when you did that, at any point, did you grab a big guy and like throw him 20 feet in the air?
No, but I did sing Kiss from a Rose. What I thought you were going to say was how strange it was that Lana spends so much time with Kent Clark, this kind of odd, misshapen Frankenstein creature with a very distinctive voice. And then a beat later, Bizarro arrives dressed as Superboy. And it never occurs to her to kind of go, what was that all about?
Don't worry. That was my next point. No, I was thinking the same thing too. It's like there's never any acknowledgement of why would Bizarro dress up like you, Clark?
Yeah.
Nothing. It's just not acknowledged at all. It is what it is, but it just feels like that would be a natural question to ask. And I'm sure Clark would come up with something, but yeah. I also, speaking of Kent Clark, or more specifically Clark Kent, as you and I talked about earlier, and we talked a lot about last week, we are in the season now, season 2 of the bumbling Christopher Reeve-esque Clark, which is not my preferred lane for the character. There is an interesting scene here, though, before the costume party where Clark is on the phone as himself, essentially, and then Andy and Lana walk in as he's hanging up the phone, and all of a sudden, like, you see him get the glasses and he pushes them up and he slumps and the voice gets higher and you see him slip right into the Clark disguise. Even though I don't like the Clark disguise, from an acting standpoint, I did appreciate what he was doing in that moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have to be very careful what I say here because the man is not only a friend of your show, but a friend of ours. I think the reason the quote-unquote Clark Kent disguise works as well as it does in the Christopher Reeve movies is because Christopher Reeve is the greatest Superman actor of all time and may always be, and was just a skilled actor, trained in theater. When he went home to his father and he said he was playing Superman, his father asked, "Oh, man and Superman, of course, the esteemed text and all this kind of stuff." He didn't realize he was talking about the comic book character. My point is, it's not in everybody's wheelhouse to play that particular version, the bumbling Clark. And I think especially on a TV show where you're spending time with that character every week, I'm going through this big Zorro phase right now. I'm watching all these Zorro TV shows, and that was a thing that Superman borrowed from Zorro, that the idea that he's bumbling in his alter ego and it's to throw people off the scent, that he's secretly this dashing hero. You know, a lot of the Zorro TV shows have the same thing in common. They never do that in the TV show because it would get irritating. Yeah. And I think they very quickly realized that on the Superboy show is this doesn't work on a weekly show. And there's a big part of why I don't go back to season 2 as often as I go back to the other seasons. And Bumbling Clark is one of them. But to your point, I definitely think Gerard Christopher, they definitely came up with some interesting scenarios for him, but it just always felt a little bit too Saved by the Bell for me. It didn't have that same feel as the Daily Planet scenes in the Reeve movies.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But as we make our way through this two-parter, so Bizarro is all confused and thinks that Lana is supposed to be with him and literally takes her away at the end of that two-parter and leaves at the end of the first part and leaves Superboy to succumb to the effects of kryptonite. Thankfully, Andy happens along and is able to help Superboy. We have Bizarro take Lana to this department store, furniture store that's closed conveniently, but it leads to a moment that genuinely made me laugh where they're in the store, we cut away, then we come back to them and they're at the table and Bizarro's like, "Why you not eat? You not hungry?" And she's like, "It's plastic."
Oh my goodness.
And it was so funny because it would have been so easy for them to telegraph that if they had focused on the bowl, if there had been any reference to it. But they got me because the scene just starts and they're at the table and there's something on her plate and it happened so quickly that when she's like, "It's plastic," it's like, well, of course it's plastic. It was so funny. This is also another instance where you have a bad guy who takes Lana, who is interested in Lana. I mean, if we counted up the number of times the adversary of the week went this route, it's quite a significant number, especially in the early seasons.
Oh yeah, and shout out to Stacey Hyduke, by the way. Like, talking about people who just give it their all every single time, no matter the material. Like, she always, like, you completely believe the kind of precarious situation she's in, and she takes it so seriously. There's never any winking with her. Like, she's always completely committed to the scene, and it makes sense that she was the only one there, you know, for the entire run of the show. But you know, she's top notch. She's so good on this.
Another thing we talked about last week, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, especially as we're here in season 2, and I just mentioned him, but where do you land on Andy McAllister?
Again, there's a reason I don't go back to season 2 as often. I think TJ in season 1 was great, and I can't understand why they got rid of him. Like, I've never really heard a solid answer for why they thought, like, you know, there's all this stuff about John Newton now. We don't know. There's conflicting sources as to what happened there, but TJ, like, that worked. Like, why did you get rid of him? And there's the whole connection to Perry White, all that stuff. Not crazy on Andy. I understand the logic in it. He was on Weird Science. They're going for kind of a John Hughes vibe. It just always feels like older male writers who are completely out of touch with youth culture trying to write a young character. I love Lan Mitchell-Smith in other stuff. I just never really worked for me in this. I gotta be honest.
No, same here. I think that was such a misstep to drop the TJ character. Side note, you'll appreciate this because you've been recommending this to me, and I didn't ask you to reread any of it because I didn't know if I would actually get to it or not, but I did. The 22 issue plus a special comic book series that ran alongside the television show. I bought it on eBay a while back when I bought the New Adventures of Superboy Bronze Age comic series and all that. But I read it. I read the series. There were a few that I kind of skipped if something wasn't particularly jumping out at me, but I read the majority of the series. It was interesting, and I bring it up here specifically because this cuts both ways. They do a whole issue that leads to TJ leaving.
Yes.
Which I appreciated, as opposed to just a mention in the beginning of season 2 of like, oh, he's gone. So there is a whole issue where things aren't going right for him. These mishaps, his grades aren't good. He's kind of having a hard time. He's trying to get a stand-up career going. And then ultimately he does leave to pursue a stand-up career. And he has this notion or note about, well, if that doesn't work out, maybe I'll go work for my dad at the Daily Planet. There's also a later issue where Superboy time travels to present-day Metropolis, the world of Superman, and TJ now has his own talk show. So that's a positive, I think, where you got to see, okay, what was the idea behind what led to him actually leaving. But in those first few issues, then he leaves in issue 4, I felt like they gave TJ a personality transplant. He was coming across far more obnoxious. He honestly read more like Andy.
Yeah.
In those early issues. So I don't know what that was about. I don't know if they were purposely trying to, for lack of a better term, bring the character down so you wouldn't be sad when he goes. But it didn't feel like I was reading the TJ from season 1 of the TV series in those first few issues of the comic. I don't know how much of a memory of this you have. I'm sure it's been a while.
Yeah. Not a lot, I'll be honest. I did, like, it wasn't that long ago I was rereading them, but I don't recall thinking that about the TJ characterization. I need to go back to it, yeah.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, it's not the most salient part of the series, but it definitely stood out, especially in the context of this.
Yeah. Every time I read those, I'm always wondering when in the chronology, the production of the series, they wrote them, because surely, Gerard Christopher is on the cover. So why would you be like recalling season 1, which at that point they were trying to ignore and move, sort of way. So I feel like they must have cast Gerard Christopher and they were in production of season 2 and they started writing this comic. And that's why TJ appears so prominently in the first couple of episodes.
I would say, so I don't think I have a whole episode in me on the comic book series. It's kind of an interesting curiosity. I'm glad I have it. This is probably all that I really have to say about it. But it in terms of the visual representation, this is not like a Superman 78 situation where you read it and it's like, oh, that's Gerard, that's Stacy. I don't know if it was a choice or a likeness issue. I don't know, but it doesn't really feel like you're looking at the actors on the page there. But what was interesting, I suppose, was that it does kind of blend the different aspects of the show in a way that the TV series didn't. So to your point, the fact that we're now in the quote unquote Gerard era of the show, yet you have TJ there at the beginning. And then later on in the comic book series, just like the show, they have Clark and Lana become interns at the Bureau, but you actually see them apartment hunting, which was cool. And well, cool might be a strong word, but at least it shows you a little bit of the background. But then you also see them back at Schuster periodically with Andy, which is something that on the TV series, you think they just work there full time and they're completely done with college. But the book shows, okay, like they're still kind of going back and forth. So it was kind of interesting. And then there was an issue, I think you might have mentioned this to me off mic, but Mark Waid wrote one that was particularly interesting, where this young girl was obsessed with Superboy and she has the science experiment that he kind of inadvertently ignores. And then she frames him for murder and he's on trial and he's able to deduce that she's actually alive and that he, kind of overlooked her and he gets her help. But that was one that stood out. I thought that was pretty strong.
Yeah. And to your point about, character arcs and stuff like that, Professor Peterson, who is really prominent in the first 2 seasons of the show and then just sort of quietly disappears. He's mentioned once, I think, in Roads Not Taken, but we never see him again. Could have been that the actor George Chakiris was an actor of some renown, so he may have just not wanted to come back or whatever. I don't know. But definitely in the tie-in comic, he turns up a couple of times. And at one stage, he meets a fellow scientist, and then in future issues, then they develop a relationship and eventually that becomes a romance. And so they really develop things in the comics, like in a way that they don't really on the show, which I just think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say overall for me, I guess what stood out the most was just that on the TV series, I think there were certain aspects of the show that were really in very separate boxes. And the comic book kind of opened that up a little bit and you had more of that intermingling. So it was kind of cool. I'm glad that I watched it. But getting to the climax here of the battle with Bizarro, after the green kryptonite failed, Peterson realizes that everything is backwards. So if they're going to try to stop Bizarro, they need to use the ray on kryptonite and create Bizarro kryptonite. And Superboy is ultimately able to use it on Bizarro. And one key aspect that we haven't mentioned here is that Peterson learns that the duplicates made via the ray are unstable and will ultimately explode. When, how long it takes is variable, but that anything created is unstable and will ultimately blow up. So there is, in addition to just Lana being in danger generally, there is also this ticking time bomb where Bizarro could go off at any minute. And to everyone's surprise, when Superboy uses the Bizarro kryptonite on him at the carnival, it actually cures him of this ticking time bomb condition here. And I guess,
I love Professor Peterson's moment of kind of going, of course, how did I overlook this? Kryptonite weakens you, and because he's an imperfect duplicate, it cures it. Like he just has this kind of course, why didn't I realize? You're like, because it's completely all over the place and pie in the sky, and this is just nonsense science.
I know.
I love that moment.
That was funny. But in that moment, this is where I think we get at one of those key ideas, because for all the talk of he's made out of artificial matter and he's not really alive, in those final scenes, he sees what actual love is when he sees how Superboy and Lana regard each other. And he sees what that is, and he actually sheds a tear and apologizes to Superboy and says he won't cause any more trouble and leaves. He leaves the Earth at the very end of that two-parter. So, I mean, I'm glad he came back and there was so much more that they did with him. But even if it had just been that, I mean, it was really, I think, a powerful introduction for this character.
And it predates the Terminator 2, why do you cry? You know, the question of tears. No, it's really, really good. Yeah. Maybe he goes off to found Bizarro Earth.
Yeah.
Hit Trey.
I know. That aspect of the Bizarro mythology I've never been too hot on, but I don't know. I'm open to it. I will say one more note about the comic. There is a Bizarro issue where he comes back to Earth, and this photographer who works at the Herald with Clark, she makes Bizarro part of her performance art at an art gallery exhibition sort of thing. But the reason I bring this up is when Bizarro returns in that comic book issue from space, Superboy says to him, and I'm pretty sure this is the line, he's like, I thought you went to space to die or something. And as I was reading it, I was like, what?
Thanks, brother.
What the hell? Yeah, that felt out of character. I don't know. I don't know. The comic book series, by the way, was written by John Moore, primarily, though there were other writers. For example, Mark Waid did an issue, Dan Jurgens did an issue, and drawn, at least initially, by Jim Mooney, and then Kurt Swan also did a bunch of issues as well. But that was another thing that jumped out at me. And then Bizarro comes back.
John Moore, by the way, I don't know if you know, he also wrote the tie-in comic for The Flash, the John Wesley Shipp tie-in comic, which bizarrely is on DC Infinite, but none of these Superboy things are, unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't know that the Flash one was on there. That's actually, I'm very surprised because this Superboy one is totally MIA. But speaking of the Flash series, a thought I had, especially when we got into the third and fourth seasons of the Superboy show, and we're in these darker lit nighttime scenes and everything, it so felt like we could have had a crossover between Superboy and the Flash, that those worlds could have come together. What do you think?
I think that I'm in a safe enough place that I can admit to you, Anthony, and hopefully nobody ever listens to this episode, but I can admit to you in complete confidence that once upon a time, I may have just about written some fan fiction where just such a thing happened.
Yeah, man, this is as safe a space as any. We all have, here's the thing, going back to what I said before, we all have the things that we were super passionate about, whatever it is. So, no, that's cool. That's cool.
If I remember correctly, it was Gerard Christopher, and at that point he was Superman, and The Flash and Michael Keaton's Batman all team up. And I couldn't for the life of me tell you what they teamed up to do, but that definitely was something that I put, I was about to say pen to paper, but I would have typed it out on Windows, whatever, 2000 at the time. So now that being said, my heart will always be with Lois and Clark, and I think there is too much connective tissue between the Flash and Lois and Clark to fully commit to Superboy as being the one that's in the same universe. But no, to your point, I absolutely see how you could draw a connection between the two. The sort of noir look, the blatant Batman 89 influence, and the kind of, nighttime aesthetic of them. They definitely do share a lot of connective tissue, yeah.
I will admit I still have not watched the entire Flash series, but with the forthcoming Blu-ray, I will be correcting that.
Man, cards on the table here, right? The Flash pilot, I think, is incredible. It's absolutely one of the greatest superhero things ever. I absolutely love it. There's a couple of great episodes. There's a bunch of clangers in there. There's a bunch of really, really bad episodes. Especially immediately after the pilot, there's a bunch of ones that are just barely watchable. So I totally understand how, you can kind of go, ooh, I don't know, I'm stepping away from this.
Listen, I made it through 100 episodes of Superboy So I think I'll
But
be
they're
all right.
25 minutes though.
Oh, that's true. All right. Fair. That is fair. Yeah. That will be something to get used to. And I have seen the Flash pilot. That's all I've seen of the show, but I did enjoy it. But
Oh, the pilot is so good. So good.
in any event, so circling back to Bizarro here, Bizarro returns for The Bride of Bizarro, the two-parter that kicks off season 3, which ushers in this new era of the show. Its third and final iteration, where now we have Clark and Lana away from Schuster University. They're working as interns at the Bureau for Extranormal Matters. And Bizarro returns to Earth. He picks up satellite waves of this talk show talking about bizarre relationships. And he comes to Earth looking for love. And unfortunately is essentially recruited and led astray by Lex Luthor, who promises to create him a Bizarro bride if Bizarro kills Superboy. And Bizarro is initially reluctant, but again, there is this defective, confused quality to him, and he is led astray. And he does go so far as to steal this kryptonite from a military base and then battle with Superboy and leave him for dead on the rooftop with that kryptonite at the end of that first part.
So first of all, just to circle back to what you were saying about the change in the style, it's like there's just an enormous leap in quality here. Like, a second ago we were talking about Battle with Bizarro, and we were on a strip mall in Orlando in the middle of the day, and it just looks so cheap and so B-movie and so whatever. Suddenly we're in these huge, incredible, like noirish, timeless movie sets that look like this movie. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's as if everybody involved in the show went out to the movies and watched a little film called Batman 1989. And they decided that the show needed to match the sort of enormous cultural presence of that film. And to be honest, I think on this low budget, I think they pulled it off. To your point about the rest of it, I just think this episode is badass, man. I think if I could point to any episode of Superboy where I'm like, no, actually, there's something going on here. There's a bunch of really, really solid bottle episodes, and we'll talk about that in a while. In terms of a big slap bang, throw down, action-packed Superman kind of adventure, I think this is just a humdinger. It's so good, and you were talking before about who's responsible for maybe changing the trajectory of the series. I've heard from different people that maybe it was Julia Pistor, who was supervising producer, and she maybe had a role in the overall production of the series. But meanwhile, Stan Berkowitz, he's involved at this stage, and Mike Carlin and Andy Helfer, celebrated comic book writers, they wrote this episode. Yep. So just great stuff across the board in this one.
Yeah, I think Julia Pistor and Stan Berkowitz, I feel like that's the 1-2 punch, where between the actual scripts that are being crafted and then the overall look and feel of the show, I really think it was the two, hand in hand with all the writers, like you said, but really kind of pushing the show to a new place. And, going back to the music, of course, the Superboy theme itself is it's a banger, man. It's great. And the whole time I was watching the show, I was always humming it, and it was in my head, and I was happy to have it there. It's great. But then there's also smaller things, but no less important, like the musical stinger that goes along with Kryptonite every time that appears, which you don't have at the beginning.
Now, small nitpick. Originally, in the earlier seasons, that's the Lex Luthor theme, and then they kind of changed that to be the Kryptonite theme. Slightly bothered me, but it does work better as the Kryptonite theme. I love it. Yeah.
No, and the music, I mean, it's kind of pulsating as you have Superboy trying to crawl away from the Kryptonite, and then he falls off the building, and then that's our cliffhanger.
Shout out to Zach, by the way, who made the point. We did an episode that covered this episode as well, and Zach Moore from Always Hold On to Smallville made the point that there's so many instances in Superman stuff where he's being exposed to kryptonite and it never occurs to him to try and crawl away. And in this show, he does that. He crawls away and he falls off the building to get away from the kryptonite.
Well, I agree. And I like that. I mean, going back to the previous two-parter where, once again, the first half ends with him at the mercy of kryptonite. And then in the second half, Andy shows up. I had the same thought. There's like, can you not crawl away? It's like, is it so debilitating? I mean, I guess it's like, it's so debilitating. You can't even move. But if your life depended on it, would you not muster something. And so, no, I agree. I loved I love the way this played. And I would always hope to see more like that, right? Just there's some movement, something. But in any event, as we continue to move forward here, so Lex steals a duplicate array and creates a duplicate of Darla, his girlfriend associate, his Miss Tessmacher, essentially.
Tessmacher, yeah.
She's quite an unsung hero. We'll talk more about her next week, but I enjoy Darla's role on the series. And it doesn't go the way any of them planned because Bizarro Darla loves Lex because she's an imperfect copy of Darla. And on top of that, she explodes. And as she explodes, Lex pushes her towards Bizarro. So now Bizarro is angry towards Lex, and ultimately they split. We ultimately get to this, I think, really interesting scene between Superboy and Bizarro on the rooftop. And I think at this point, Lana's been taken, where Lex has had the idea that he needs to make the copy of Lana, somebody who loves Superboy, and then the Bizarro copy of her will love Bizarro. But the scene between Superboy and Bizarro on the roof where Superboy is trying to get Bizarro to help, and this is where you have him articulating, like, you're a part of me, but we're the same. Like, I know what it's like to be different and to want what other people have. And I think it's this scene where Bizarro looks down at the reflection and he's like, no, like, I'm not, like, me not stupid. I see we don't look the same. And yes, there is that physical divide between the two of them, but they do both know what it's like to be apart from those around them in a very significant way. And it's something that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because even though I just watched all 100, a lot of it is really blurring together. You might have a more specific memory of episodes, but I don't feel like that's an idea that you really see this Clark really struggle with or talk about much. I mean, that little Hercules episode with young Joaquin Phoenix in season 1, I guess that kind of touches on it as well. Like someone, this genius level kid who's different, but overall, I mean, that's not really much of a driver for this character, right?
No, not really. The only other episode I can think of is a season 4 episode, Into the Mystery, which I even amongst Superboy fans is an underrated episode. I really, really like that one. It's where Clark, it explores the relationship Clark has with his eccentric aunt, who is like Martha Kent's sister, I guess.
Not Cassie.
And she's
Cassandra.
Really different, and she sees Cassandra, and she sees the world in a different way. And Clark really gravitates to her as a young boy because he's so different and he doesn't really relate to other people. And it's just really, really lovely episode. It was written by J.M. DeMatteis. We interviewed him about it on our show, and he had such lovely things to say about it. He wanted to do an episode about death, and well, I've kind of spoiled what happens in the episode now. But to your point, that's the only other one I can think of where that kind of comes up.
I love that episode, and that is a testament to DeMatteis, because he can do those kind of more cosmic, mystical, supernatural takes in a way that I normally don't gravitate towards that. And by the way, as we're here talking about antagonists for Superboy, we're talking about Bizarro, we'll touch on Mixie and Kryptonite Kid and Metallo, but there's a lot of supernatural threats on this series. And as the audience knows, the whole idea of Superman's weakness to magic and stories that really delve into that, they just have never really lit my fire for whatever reason. And so I remember queuing up the Aunt Cassandra, and I say the name because throughout the episode, everyone refers to her as Cassie, and Clark is always quick to correct them. It's Cassandra. And they have this bond from when he was little. And I remember queuing it up, and you see death early on, and I'm like, what the hell is this one going to be? And it ended up being so sweet and moving, as death essentially is allowing Superboy this opportunity to find and reconnect with her aunt before she passes. And it's such a beautiful episode, but it ends on that line where she says, "It's okay, Clark. It's one more adventure, one more step into the mystery." I'm just like, what? Like, people say this is a really bad show. Like, yeah. But anyway, that scene on that rooftop with Clark and Bizarro, I love it because it's tapping into this struggle that is not often articulated, but you have to imagine it's a part of him. And yes, as someone who watched a decade of Smallville religiously, the desire to be normal was such a huge part of that character. But not only to have him talk about it, but to have that be the basis of forming a greater understanding with Bizarro. And Bizarro does ultimately come around. He is once again led astray with when Lex creates Bizarro Lana, but it's Bizarro Lana who's ultimately able to then get through to him, and he teams up to defeat Lex. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was, and he gets, Bizarro gets his happy ending, in that episode. He gets Bizarro
Yeah.
Lana and they fly off together.
And I love that kind of ultimatum Bizarro Lana gives him. It's like, well, no, if you kill Superboy, I can't love you. And that's why he chooses to change it. I just think that's powerful stuff for something that was essentially aimed at kids. And, looking at some of the other Bizarro stories we've looked at, even in the comics, where it's just played for laughs and he's just dismissed as this nothing thing, they did something really lovely with it, and it's very obviously they're taking a lot from Bride of Frankenstein, but they're paying homage to it in a good way, in a strong kind of powerful way. I think it's really, really well done. And it's so funny because, for so long, everyone had completely forgotten that this show even existed at all. And to talk back about how the Superboy fans maybe overcompensate a little bit and they oversell how good this show is. It's episodes like this where you're kind of like, oh no, I get that. If you told me that this show existed and this episode existed, and then suddenly everyone forgot about it for 20 years, of course you'd want to tell everybody that it was the greatest thing in the world, that kind of way, compared to, as much as I have a certain fondness for it, the Lois and Clark Bizarro episode is the only other thing we had for, however many years, until the Smallville episode was the only other thing we had. Like, of course you would look to this and go, no, this was the greatest thing ever,
Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Dude, 1,000%. I mentioned last time in my viewing of this series, I was struggling a bit during season 1. Like I said, the aspects that I liked, ultimately I didn't get as much mileage out of it as you did. But there was that Phantom of the Third Dimension episode.
Nobody did.
Towards the end where it was the first time where I really found myself kind of connecting with it in a way that I hadn't before. Yeah. And I said, okay. But then it was early on in season 2, watching that initial Bizarro 2-parter where I said, oh, like now we're cooking here. Like, now there's something here. That was really the first time in this viewing where I said, oh, like I get what Rob and other folks are talking about when they talk about this show. It was genuinely compelling. And at the end of the Bride of Bizarro, you also get this great visual gag of the army of Bizarro Lexes.
Oh my goodness.
To cover Lex's escape. And then Lex has this line to Darla, like, did you treat them with the Bizarro kryptonite? And she's like, no. And then they all start exploding. It was great. Now, I have a question that will lead us into Bizarro's final 2-parter, To Be Human, which is Lex says when he introduces Bizarro Lana that she's been treated with the Bizarro kryptonite such that she won't detonate. Mm-hmm. Cut ahead to season 4 and the beginning of the To Be Human 2-parter, you see Bizarro and Bizarro Lana at their crooked house and their morning routine and having breakfast and runny eggs and burnt toast that's just perfect for them. It's perfectly in keeping for what you would expect for these characters. And then she starts smoking and explodes and the entire house goes up and they express their love to each other before this happens. It's just genuinely heartbreaking. Mm. And then later there's this discussion about why she blew up. And I forget now, is it Superboy or the scientist? But there's this line about the instability of the duplicating process. But my take on it is that Lex and Darla never treated her with the Bizarro kryptonite. Is that your read on it as well? Or she was treated, but she still just blew up somehow anyway?
My take on it was, yeah, she was treated, but maybe it was a temporary fix, and they didn't have a clear idea of how long it would actually last. Whereas Bizarro has Superboy Kryptonian DNA in him, so his cellular structure is such that he wouldn't explode. He has a longer lifespan than human Bizarros, if that makes sense. That was always my read on it. Now it's speculative nonsense, pseudoscience, but that's always how I read it. Yeah.
That's a good explanation, and I could go with that. I guess deep down, I say to myself, I don't think they would have actually used they would have used the Bizarro kryptonite on. Like, it feels like something they would have just lied about. And since we don't have an exact clock on how long this would take, but in any event, it is a truly heartbreaking kickoff to Bizarro's final two-parter here, where he loses this love and he buries her, and he has this tribute to her outside their demolished home. And ultimately, I guess this comes onto Clark's radar because there's a villain, Chaos, who's been blowing up things throughout the city, and word comes to the Bureau about this explosion outside the city. And Clark realizes, no, that wouldn't have been the work of Chaos. He realizes that it's Bizarro. And he goes to Bizarro, and this was another great moment. Like, here's the thing, and to the show's credit, it's one thing to just say, oh, they're like brothers, but you see moments of this, and one of them is when Bizarro is here in his grief and his despair, and Superboy extends his hand and offers him hope and says, come with me. Like, I love it so much.
I really like that bit. I will admit it's maybe a touch too earnest, in terms of the acting and the framing of it. It's a little bit soap opera, and I could see someone watching that going, "Ooh, I don't know about this, guys." But no, I think the meaning and the ambition and the thought behind it is really, really nice, and it is pure Superman. The whole episode, the sympathy and the empathy he has for this creature, and the fact that he wants to inspire him to be better than he is, and he wants to give him a helping hand in his moment of grief. Like, it's pure Superman. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And he takes him to, what is it? The Technology for Peace Center Institute, something like that. I think it's called Technology for Peace.
Technology for Peace. Yeah.
And a new doctor here, and he wants to get help for Bizarro. Here's what I love about the show in this two-parter, and another instance of their ambition. And this was another J.M. DeMatteis written pair of episodes. Yes. It would have been super easy, no pun intended, to just put the two of them in these chambers and just kind of have it, and all of a sudden he's just human. But they actually took the time. I mean, the science of exactly what they're doing in those chambers is a little wonky, where they're transmitting
life force.
Yeah, waves or life force from Superboy and Bizarro. But that's essentially what helps unjumble his brain. But then there's this whole montage of the doctor teaching Bizarro. And then all of this discussion about they're going to use skin grafts. They've made developments in synthetic skin, and they're going to use all of these skin grafts to make him look human. So, and you see the progression of this, where he undergoes the surgery, and then he's all wrapped up in bandages and a trench coat outside, and then eventually the bandages come off.
Lot of Darkman vibes in this episode. Are you familiar with the movie Darkman?
Generally, yeah.
Like, the whole plot of that movie is synthetic skin, and then obviously the look of the character is he looks like the Invisible Man. He's got bandages around him, and then later on in this episode we see a guy with scarred face and scarred hands. Don't know, maybe somebody saw Darkman. Sorry, just a small thought I had watching it yesterday.
Maybe. But it's great when they come out of that machine, and initially it overloads, right? But then they come out of the machine and Bizarro's going kind of crazy, and all of a sudden we go from to, hey, anybody got an aspirin?
Oh my God.
Like, it's such a cool moment. And then you mentioned this before, but when now human Bizarro, who goes by the name Bill Zorro, shows up at, I was going to say the planet, at the Bureau, and Clark rushes him outside. I agree. Both times I watched this, my read initially was still the same, that Clark was worried that his cover was going to be blown. But no, like, he was genuinely excited at the prospect of what had been accomplished with Bill Zorro. It was great. And then ultimately the tragedy of this is that the process weakened Superboy. He's dizzy and he's not operating at full capacity, and he ends up getting taken by Chaos, this terrorist who's been blowing things up. And even then, going back to what you said before about just the kindness of Superboy and the care, even then, there's a point where he and Chaos are in the car and Superboy, I guess, grabs the wheel and they crash, and then Chaos is coming to drag him out. And even then, Superboy's like, let me help you. I think it was that episode.
So good. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So it really taps into these core ideals of the character. But then ultimately, it's this decision that Bizarro is faced with when Superboy's been taken and Chaos is threatening to throw him off a building, of reversing the process and getting his powers back as Bizarro to save him. What was your reaction to how that idea was presented? The fact that the doctor suggested it to him and he was initially pretty reluctant. What did you make of that?
Sorry, so reluctant to the initial experiment?
No,
or
the reversal of it.
No, I thought it made sense. I mean, Superboy's life was in danger. I guess he was reluctant to give up what he had, and there was so much at stake. And he was still coming to terms with this newfound intelligence. He would have the sense of kind of self-interest and selfishness that, a teenager would have. So it made sense that he was reluctant initially, but that he had to come to terms with it. And I think I actually really, really like that the final happy ending of this episode was that the quick fix didn't really work and it had consequences. And that actually we just have to come to terms with exactly who Bizarro is. And there's nothing wrong with that. And he can absolutely become a better person just the way he is. And I think that actually that stands the test of time as, an understanding of, people on the autism spectrum and stuff like that there's nothing wrong with them, and they can learn just like anybody else. And I think that's probably a better lesson to learn than, oh, well, there's a magic spell that can fix them, that kind of way.
Absolutely. And the fact that, at the end, he's going to leave and the doctor stops and she's like, where do you think you're going? We have more work. And there's this whole DeMatteis, man, there's so much layered in here because he undergoes the skin graft, right, to look human, but he's modeled after the doctor's late son.
Yeah. So, Shades of Knight Rider.
So there's that whole component to it as well. But the fact that she's like, no, you stay. And we end with him learning and practicing the alphabet and everything. And Superboy has that line to him where he's like, you're as human a soul as I've ever known. And exactly just that idea. It's not how well maybe you can express yourself or what you look like, but really who you are. And who Bizarro is that selfless, kind, pure character who gave up everything that he ever wanted in order to save his brother. And I also, I really had quite a good time with these episodes. The other thing too is when the way the doctor ultimately gets through to Bill, because he is reluctant. And I liked that. That's why I brought up that question to you. I like the fact that Bill wasn't quick to say, oh, well, let's just reverse it and I'll help him. Of course he would be reluctant. And his initial instinct is, well, can't the police do this? Let the police do their job. You get it. You get why he wouldn't want to give that up. But then Bill goes to visit his shrine to Bizarro Lana. And the doctor goes there and she's like, oh, Bizarro Lana, she was just a hideous. She was a monster. And he's like, no, she wasn't. I loved her. And then he has this moment of realization of oh, no, she was a Bizarro. I still loved her for who she was. And that's ultimately what turns the tide. My only critique of is this two-parter. I wish it weren't a two-parter. I wish we could have been with Bill Bizarro for a longer part of the season. Even if he's not in every episode, he pops up more of a recurring character and then he has to give this up. It would have packed even more of a punch, but man, this was so good.
I don't always like the way they kind of handle Lana's feelings for other characters. And this is true of pretty much every Superman show. But I do kind of like in this episode how she has this immediate attraction to Bizarro and she kind of goes, he kind of reminds me of Superboy in a weird way. And again, just credit to Stacey Hyduke. That could have been dropped like a lead balloon, but she just kind of sells it a little bit. She just realizes there's something about this guy and there's something about him she really digs. And I liked that little touch there as well.
Same. Yeah. No, that was a nice bit for sure. Now,
quick bit of trivia. Actually, you mentioned the chambers at the start of the episode. Have to shout out to my conversation with Gerard Christopher a year or two ago. He mentioned to us that in a Bizarro episode, and I suspect it was this one, he was in a chamber and they were transferring life force or whatever, and it filled with this kind of prop smoke. And he recalls that he told us a story whereby the smoke they were filling the chamber with made him kind of like stumble around, kind of like he was getting high off the smoke. And he fell out the fiberglass chamber and broke it. And they had to, like, he fainted and he kind of fainted and fell out of it and broke the whole thing. And they had to reset and rebuild the chamber.
Oh, geez.
I just thought that was really funny.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. I can imagine. You know,
suffering for his art.
What this reminds me of is the classic Flowers for Algernon story, but
Flowers
in the comic book realm, the Flowers. Did you ever read? There was a Spider-Man series called Spider-Man's Tangled Web.
Flowers for Rhino.
Yeah. Oh, I love that
baby.
series.
It's an
anthology series, rotating creative teams, and that one so stood out to me. And then It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia also did a Flowers for Charlie episode, which was very funny as well. But the Rhino story, like that's what this made me think of, where you take this character who really can't think straight, and then they're given this intelligence, and then ultimately have to lose it. It's interesting stuff. I
brought that up with J.M. DeMatteis when we spoke to him. I was like, was it by any chance? He was very impressed that I knew his Flowers for Algernon. Now, I have to admit, the reason I'm so familiar with Flowers for Algernon, to talk about the other versions you mentioned, there's a Simpsons episode, Flowers for Homer, where they reveal that the reason it's just at the precipice of Simpsons getting bad. There's an episode where they kind of retcon that the reason Homer is so silly and so stupid is that he had a crayon hammered into his brain many years ago, and Moe takes the crayon out and he becomes a genius. And then over the course of the episode, he realizes that he was happier the way he was, and they crammed the crayon back in. So That's how I knew what Flowers for Algernon was.
Gotcha. So we've passed the hour and a half mark. I don't want to keep you here forever. We can maybe do the other villains as a little bit more of a lightning round sort of deal here. But
sure, absolutely.
We spent the bulk of our time, appropriately so, on Bizarro. And like I said, next week we're going to talk about Lex Luthor on the series and the evolution that he goes through in more ways than one. A lot to unpack there, which we already touched on, but we'll get more specific with that. But there's a quartet of comic book adversaries who are realized on screen here over the course of the series. Mxyzptlk, Metallo, Kryptonite Kid, and Nick Knack, who essentially is Toyman, though they can't call him that. And I mentioned this last week. I think, one of the things that the show deservedly gets credit for is being the first to do live action interpretations of a lot of these characters, including all the ones that we're talking about here. Obviously, I got a lot of mileage out of the show's version of Bizarro. When it comes to these other ones here, probably not so much. Not so much. I mean, I guess out of these four, where would you like to start?
So I guess we'll get the bad ones out of the way. I have absolutely no reverence at all for Nick Knack.
Okay.
Just does nothing for me at all. I really like, oh my goodness. I'm blanking on his name.
Gilbert Gottfried.
I love him in other stuff. I love him as Mxyzptlk in Superman the Animated Series.
Yes.
Doesn't really do it for me in these episodes, and they're episodes that I do not return to very often.
Yeah, he's in two. One is just called Nick Knack, and it's episode 21 of season 2. And then he comes back for The Secrets of Superboy 3 episodes later. It's primarily a clip show. So there's not a ton of new material there. But essentially he's a toy-themed villain, and it's Gilbert Gottfried. I mean, I feel like that kind of tells you you need, even if you've never seen this, it's like, that's kind of the vibe. Yeah. I'm with you, man. When we get to his Mxyzptlk in Superman the Animated Series, love it. I love it endlessly.
Amazing. Yeah.
This I got less mileage out of. Interestingly, and I know you know this, he also co-wrote an issue of that comic book series that was the origin of Nick Knack. So you get his backstory. I didn't get a ton of mileage out of this. I think if you're a big Gilbert Gottfried fan, I guess maybe you would. Yeah. I don't know. The comic book gets very meta, where in that issue, there's continual references to how Nick Knack looks and sounds like that comedian Gilbert Gottfried. So at least they had some fun with that. But so we get a Toyman-esque character, really just for one episode and then the clip show. So it's interesting because I guess we haven't compared notes about which ones we consider the stronger ones or the weaker ones. So I'll go next, I guess.
Okay.
I could not stand this Mxyzptlk.
Okay, good.
And I wanted to ask.
I'm with you.
Okay, because so you have the history with the show, and I know, like you said, with the fan sites and other fans you've talked, like I feel like you're more plugged into what the fandom thinks of certain episodes. And I don't know if people, oh no, this Mxyzptlk is great. I really did not like this Mixie.
I'm 100% with you, and this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the hardcore Superboy fans pretending that this is the greatest thing in the world. And God bless them, and I love them, and that's fine. What are we talking about here, guys? This is just too ridiculous. I talked about, at the start, how this show, it never had any doubt whatsoever in the value of the source material, for better and for worse. The Mxyzptlk episodes are for the worse. Like, it's a completely comic book accurate. He's wearing the costume. He's got all the powers. Even the effects look similar to the way they draw the kind of pop-in effects in the comic. It's just too silly. Suddenly we're watching a show for babies. And God bless him, Michael J. Pollard, who is this celebrated actor. I think he may have even won an Academy Award at one stage. He does not look like he's in the height of his powers. I don't know, man. I think Mxyzptlk is absolutely a character where less is more. And if you tone it down just a little bit and still stay true to the character, like, by the way, I think they did on both Lois and Clark, and very much when Supergirl did Mxyzptlk. I think they did a great job with Mxyzptlk on that show. I think both of those examples are how you do that character in live action. Let's not talk about Smallville, but I think this is just too much, and it just, no.
I agree. I mean, he's in 2 episodes. One is Meet Mr. Mxyzptlk in season 1, episode 16. And then he comes back from Mr. and Mrs. Superboy, where he wants Clark and Lana to be his parents in season 2. So both a rare instance on the show where both Superboy actors had a go with the same villain. And yes, I mean, I don't want to repeat you, but yes, in terms of the visual representation, it's spot on. And I maybe there are fans who are like, look, he looks just like Mxyzptlk. Sure. But it's funny. A lot of times when we talk about this, I always tend to gravitate more towards the writing, even when we look at Scott Wells as Lex Luthor in season 1. And it's
totally
not a good performance, but also I think there's only so much material there for him to work with as well. This is an instance, though, where this was just, I'm not an actor, but this was just not the right read. And I don't know if this was, there's also the direction as well. So it's not laying it all at the feet of the actor, but this was just not the right read on the character. And I don't even know how you would describe his performance.
Drunk.
Lifeless? I mean, I don't know. It was so, like lethargic's not the right word, but there was an energy that was totally missing here that you needed. Like, he was too pedestrian in the delivery of this. And he sounded like he was from New York. Like, I don't know. Like, there was a weird, nothing really came together for me in this realization of Mixie. And I know you said not to talk about Smallville, but I have to, only in that, as much as I love Smallville, I've never cared for Mikhail in season 4, but I would take Mikhail over this. I mean, I really did not care for this.
Ooh, now there's a thing. I don't know about that now. I think it's a toss-up, but I'm just about going to take, just because this one is so bad and so weird and so noteworthy, whereas Mikhail is just such a what? Like,
that's fair. If you were going just based on pure like curiosity, like you got to see this. Yeah. Okay, small, Superboy. I'll give you that. That's fair. But yeah, this take, like, I kept saying to myself, and obviously at this time, given his stature and the fact that we're talking about a low budget syndicated show, obviously it never would have been him, but like Danny DeVito.
Oh yeah.
If you had done like a Danny DeVito thing with this, I could see something like that working. This is not that. I don't know what this is. I don't have the best description for it, but this just did not work for me. And it's a bummer because, like you said, the look is there, the effect, in terms of his, the sitting and the floating, like they were trying for something, but it did not work.
Oh, and man, talking about other actors, Gilbert Gottfried was apparently right there. They could have used him. That might have been a better match,
Yeah, I know. So this is, I think we're kind of 0 for 2 here on this quartet. Just real quick, Kryptonite Kid only gets 1 episode here in season 4, episode 3, written by Mike Carlin and Andy Helfer. I liked this episode. This was the one, I brought this up with Gerard because this was the one where Gerard also plays Vic, the con man who's a doppelganger for Superboy and ultimately has to pose as Superboy to get close to Kryptonite Kid. I guess the thing that just strikes me about this, and this isn't even a criticism or praise, it's just more of an observation, that it is very divorced from the comic book version, where the Kryptonite Kid is this alien who's bombarded by the rays. Like here he's this government scientist who undergoes this accident. But I don't know, did this villain work for you on the show?
Yeah, I mean, hands up high, I actually have no understanding of Kryptonite Kid in the comics at all. So you're one up on me on that one. I think he's good. I think the episode isn't really about him as a villain. It's more about the story of Vic.
Yeah.
Having to take the place of Superboy and all that. My favorite thing about that episode is that he's played by Jay Underwood, who went on to play the Human Torch in the Roger Corman Fantastic Four. And in fact, even the pose he does when he's doing his kryptonite blast is the exact same pose he does as Johnny Storm. So that's something I always like to point out. Perfectly fine. I like the effect. I don't know if we've really mentioned this, but the kryptonite effect they do on the show, where his whole face glows with kind of primitive CGI, and I think there's probably an element of makeup in there as well. Always appreciate that, and they do that every time this character's on screen, the Kryptonite Kid. So that one's cool, and he's got a cool biker jacket, so that's fun.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that was a character who ultimately you would see him as Kryptonite Man in the comics, but he originated as a Superboy villain. So, just like Bizarro. So, I mean, I think it's cool that the show brought them in.
Oh, yeah, big time.
And then we have Metallo. Now, I think maybe by the time this airs, people will have heard it or they'll be hearing it soon. But you guys have an episode, right, coming up on the different iterations of Metallo.
Yep.
Where does this fall?
Yes, we do.
In that?
So the way we structured that episode was we didn't do them we did a portion on the Lois and Clark version of Metallo. We talked about the Smallville version of Metallo, both strong iterations of the character, I would argue. We obviously talked about the animated series, which is objectively the best version of Metallo, and that's fine. And everybody knows that, and that's fine. And then we got to the Superboy version. And I want to hear your take first, and then we'll come back to me.
All right, so it's played by Michael Callan, and look, I'm buying time before I even know. It's played by Michael Callan, and he appeared in essentially 5 episodes, and then has an appearance in Obituary for a superhero. But 2 appearances in season 2.
About that, he is in that one as well. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
So he appears in the 3rd episode of season 2, titled Metallo, and then he comes back in episode 13 for Super Menace. That's the one I talked about this last week, where Superboy is exposed to red kryptonite and has this brief team up with Metallo before they turn on each other. Then season 3, episode 20, the people versus Metallo, where he's on trial and he takes over the trial and tries to turn it on Superboy. And then we see clips from previous episodes. And then in season 4, there's the 2-parter, quite a title here, called Threesome, where you have Metallo and Lex Luthor and their prison psychologist teaming up, which was cool because that's, I think, really the only instance, other than maybe Bride of Bizarro, where you have Lex and Bizarro working together to an extent, but that's a different vibe, where you have like a true supervillain team up.
Yeah.
But anyway, so those are essentially the appearances that the character makes. It worked well enough for me. How do I put this? Let me see how I can say this. Like, he comes across as like more of a colorful wise guy sort of vibe.
Yeah.
Which is not at all what I would think of when I think of Metallo, nor do I think that's the ideal take on the character. And it totally avoids what I think has become a key quality of the character, the fact that he can't feel.
Yeah.
That he can't feel.
Well, Is that a key point to the character, or is that just the animated series version? Because has that survived into other stuff?
Having recently read Philip Kennedy Johnson's use of the character in Action Comics,
yeah,
I think it definitely plays into that, unless I'm totally misremembering. Okay. But at least it felt in keeping. But so here, he's still smoking cigars and drinking. He's got women around him, but he's got this, this machinery that's a part of him. I guess all to say, I found him entertaining. It wasn't the most compelling interpretation of Metallo, but at least it was something, as opposed to the Mxyzptlk, where it just felt like, what the hell are we doing here? So that's where I land. Like, he was a colorful, entertaining presence, even if it wasn't what I really see for the character. What about you?
Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. There's something compelling about him. It doesn't quite work, but I really admire the effort they made with it. And what I really like about it as well is, most other versions of Metallo are, strong, healthy, burly, muscular men, right? We've Brian Austin Green in Smallville. We've the guy in Lois and Clark. I don't know. He was famous for another sitcom as well at that stage. I think Supergirl, the guy from Mission Impossible, played him in that. In this, he's kind of just this don't belittle character actor. And I just think that's kind of a cool idea. When we started our podcast, myself and my girlfriend Saoirse were watching The Sopranos for the first time, wherein it's a show that's entirely populated with these short, stout, angry kind of Italian-American mobsters. And you really buy that they're these, hateful killers, And then late at night, I'd be watching Superboy and Metallo would come on and be like, okay, I kind of see what they were going for here. The kind of aesthetic doesn't quite, it looks like he's wearing kind of a laser tag set or something. It never looks quite right. He doesn't really feel like a man with a metallic skeleton. He just looks like a normal guy with a bunch of stuff on him.
Yes.
But what I do appreciate though is in all of the episodes, they really build up the mythology whereby it's like he has all this equipment on him, but only kryptonite makes him powerful. When he has other things powering he has this problem with his heart. He's like Tony Stark. He's got a problem with his heart, and they can power with the uranium, they can power with all this other stuff. But when they do that, he's just this sickly old man on the precipice of death. But when suddenly when they put kryptonite in, he becomes this super powerful monster. And that's just kind of a cool idea that they came up with. You spoke about People versus Metallo there. That is an episode that should not work at all. And for Zach Moore and Alan Burke in our episode, you can listen to it. They did not care for that episode. I think that's a great episode of Superboy because it kind of has this contrast between the really cool, stylish season 3 Superboy, and then they look back at these previous episodes from season 2, where it was a totally different show, and somehow it all just comes together and works. And I don't know. I get it's again. I keep coming back to this. I get why it doesn't work for people, but I just find it fascinating. And in some ways, he's like the quintessential Superboy villain in that way.
You know what? That's not a bad way of looking at it. I don't mean to gang up on you. I was not a fan of the People versus Metallo. The reason why though is that it just, the whole thing about like, no, it's really Superboy who's guilty, and just kind of his animosity towards Superboy. It doesn't, I mean, I get why he doesn't like Superboy. I get that. But the whole idea of like, he's been so wronged by Superboy, I don't know, like it doesn't really track for me. Even going back to his first appearance, he's literally like having a heart attack when he commits his first bank robbery. And then Superboy stops the car, and then he like passes out. And then he wakes up in the hospital and he kills the doctor and the guard, and he's back in the car again. And then he has another heart attack and crashes. And then he wakes up in the scientist lab who's rebuilt him. And that, like, right out of the comics, right out of the post-crisis comics, where he wakes up and it's the doctor. But I don't know. It's just sort of like the level of personal grudge that he comes to have against Superboy. It just felt like it wasn't really earned.
Totally fair. I think into the defense of the characterization and the writing, I think they're very much presenting him as an insane Batman villain as opposed to a Superman. And he's supposed to just be insane, and he's not really aware of anything that's going on. And similarly with Lex as well. I think they're both just not really fully in control of their facilities. And I think that's what they're going for. I don't know if they quite sell it, but that's the vibe I always got from Metallo in these episodes is, oh, there's something kind of just not quite right in his brain. He's just crazy. You know?
No, fair enough. Yeah, like I said, ultimately it's a take that I think has value, especially specifically in this context, even if it's not kind of what works best for the character. And his first appearance at least ties together the Kryptonite piece on the show. We talked about this, Ed and I touched on this last week with the Kryptonite Kills episode in season 1, where this meteor is discovered and Superboy realizes it hurts him, but there's really not this connection point made between the exact planet it comes from and all of that. And in the Metallo episode, you have Superboy. It's a relatively quick scene, but he's reading Professor Peterson's journal and theorizing about how it matches elements of this planet that astronomers had identified, Krypton. And so we call it kryptonite. I mean, it still never rises to the level of like, oh, it hurts me, so maybe I'm from there. So we still don't get all the way there, but at least it's like, okay, we have a name for it now, and we've put more of a label and a designation on it. So an important piece in all of this. Man, I had so much fun talking Superboy with you. I know we could go on and on, but specifically looking at these characters and Bizarro in particular, I think we did it. Anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to?
No, man, I like we got it. I again, this is just one of my favorite undiscovered corners of Superman to talk about, and I'm so glad that you're doing this, and I'm so hopeful that people go out and check out this show. And again, it's always worth saying, set your expectations. We're not, it's not Shakespeare, it's not Smallville, it's not any of these other shows, but there's something really kooky and fascinating about it. And they didn't have the resources of any of these other shows. Warner Brothers had nothing to do with the show, like, yeah, that's an anomaly in itself. It's crazy that this exists. And I just think it's so fascinating. I think people should go and check it out. And I will always be there. Anytime anybody wants to talk about Superboy, I'm here. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
No, absolutely. And I appreciate, the way you've talked about the show, even if I haven't always agreed. I mean, Rob, I think I remember a tweet where you said you would take Lex Luthor fixing basketball games in season 1 over the Batman v Superman iteration. And I read that. I was like, what, are you serious? Like, what are we doing here?
I'm afraid that's a tweet I stand by, Anthony.
No, but in all, it's fair enough. We could agree to disagree, but no, like, I love your passion for it. And I love that, like I said, you've been out like beating the drum for it. And, my fandom of the show is far more recent, right? But I do now count myself as a fan of this. And I really do hope that these episodes inspire some people to check it out. Especially, I mean, my God, like if you only are going to watch a few episodes, watch the 6 Bizarro episodes that Rob and I talked about. I think you'll have a great time with them.
Oh, and generally speaking, like, if you just want to check out the show, start at season 3 and then just work your way to the end. There's so much incredible episodes of Superman stories in season 3 and 4, and then work your way back to the other seasons. There's a lot of kooky, entertaining stuff in those. Do not start with season 1. I love it. I can talk about how much I love it all night. Start with season 3, man. There's so many great stuff in that. And, so that'd be my main piece of advice.
Right on. So now we've mentioned All-Star Superfan podcast available on all major podcast platforms and social media channels. We mentioned your recent John Byrne Man of Steel episode, your upcoming Metallo episode. What else do you want to mention to folks?
At this point in time, we have our Metallo episode will hopefully be out in the coming weeks. And then we are working on an episode with friend of the show, Matt Truex, on the Broadway musical, the 1966 Broadway musical, and its various iterations that came after that. We're hoping to do that very soon as well. We've possibly a couple of high-profile interviews in the works as well, if they work out, if we can make the dates work and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to say them just in case they don't happen. But just stay tuned. We come out once a month. We have a load of great episodes in the backlog, and we're very active on Twitter and Instagram. So check us out there.
All right. Awesome. I hope everyone will do that. Rob, I thank you for your time as always. It was really fun to get to talk Superboy with you. Audience, appreciate you tuning in as well. The Mixtapes event will continue next week. I'll be joined by Michael Bailey from Crisis to Crisis Superman podcast. We'll be talking about Lex across the 4 seasons of Superboy. So don't miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.